We continue with further examples of God's laws in Deuteronomy that talk about justice and the rule of law. It talks about judges and witnesses, that all bribe-taking and partiality are condemned, but rather judges are to, quote, follow justice and justice alone, unquote, as they conduct their duties. Perjury, which you lie before a court, could result in a penalty on the liar as great as the penalty found on the accused, as described in Deuteronomy 19:16 through 21. If you accused a man of murder, you could be executed for that false accusation if it could be proved. It even has a law that was meant to curb the power of kings when kings would come along. Kings had been predicted back in Genesis 49 that there would be a scepter in the tribe of Judah, but they didn't have a king yet. But when a king did come into power, it says this, that the king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, must not take many wives for himself, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Instead, when he takes the throne, he's to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites, and it is to be with him, and it is to be read, and he is to read it all the days of his life so that he can learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all his words and this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers and turn from the law to the right or to the left. And then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Kings were to obey God's word. Kings were not to abuse power by multiplying possessions. Kings were to be subservient to God's law, the divine law. There's a concept that Samuel Rutherford in England came up with, lex rex, which is the law is king, from which we get our concept of the rule of law. Even kings are subject to the law of God. By the way, this description of the king back in Deuteronomy 17 is almost a perfect description of the abuses of Solomon. There's rules of evidence, where it says one witness is not enough to convict a man accused of any crime or offense he may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. You can't condemn someone without sufficient evidence in court. You need at least 2 or 3 witnesses. Deuteronomy condemns abusive, arbitrary punishment on the basis of suspicion rather than solid evidence. Penalties cannot be imposed without collaborating evidence, because just one person could always be a liar. Another thing related to the court system are the cities of refuge, in which they would adjudicate between accidental manslaughter and intentional murder. So if a manslaughter has taken place, the perpetrator of that was to immediately flee to a city of refuge where they'd have a trial and determine whether he was guilty of an intentional murder, which would be a capital offense, or whether he'd be guilty of unintentional manslaughter, accidental manslaughter, in which case he might still be confined to the city of refuge till the death of the high priest, but he would not be executed. There is in Deuteronomy a law that's also found in Leviticus and Exodus called the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, where it talks about the penalty is to be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, and other versions of it add wound for wound, bruise for bruise, burning for burning, that kind of stuff. Now, what was this meant to do? It was not to be taken as a license for personal revenge. That's how some have interpreted it, including some Jews in Jesus' day. If you interpret it that way, then an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, if it justifies you taking personal revenge, is, as one person has put it, the quickest and surest way to an eyeless and toothless world. But the real purpose of this law was to limit punishment. Only one life for the life taken, only one hand for the hand maimed, and so forth. Moreover, it worked within a system in which monetary equivalents were allowed, in which if you damage the eye of another person, you very likely could pay the monetary equivalent of an eye rather than having your eye poked out. The purpose of this law was to exclude all disproportional punishments, and therefore it is a principle of justice that the punishment should fit the crime. There's also a law that limits corporal punishment, that you were to have no more than 40 lashes if you are corporally punished, out of respect for the dignity even of criminals, Deuteronomy 25. Another principle of justice: punish the person, but not the family. It says, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for his own sin. Now, in this case, is in contrast to what you'll see in the book of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar, who will not only kill the fathers, but also kill all their family and destroy their houses and things of that sort. But here it says that the punishment should be limited to the person who did the crime. You don't punish children for what fathers did or vice versa. It also has rules of war that we'll talk about when we get to the historical books that limit the killing to the fighting men, and tries to limit the destruction, and seeks to make treaties first, but we'll discuss that more in a later lecture. Here's a law about divorce. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, and after she leaves his house and becomes the wife of another man, and the second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then the first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, this is one of many sexual regulations in Deuteronomy. So you have laws such as don't wear the clothing of the opposite sex. Men shouldn't wear women's clothing, and women shouldn't wear men's clothing. Dressing in drag, you might say. It condemns adultery, but also condemns false accusations of one's spouse for adultery. It condemns rape. Rape would be a capital offense if the woman was betrothed. It's fined with a very high fine otherwise. And then this law on divorce that we've read, and there's going to be a section on sexuality in the Pentateuch that I'll have you read in the readings that will elaborate on this. Divorce was allowed, but only with some cause, some indecency, literally nakedness of a thing. And interestingly, remarriage to the first husband was prohibited if another marriage intervened. And exactly why is subject to debate, so I'll leave that for the moment. It also has rules about levirate marriage. Levirate marriage is when a woman's husband dies before she has children, and there was a rule that the man's brother was to marry her and have a child through her, and that first male child would be the heir to the husband's inheritance. This was a way of taking care of widows in that culture. Now, Deuteronomy begins a section on blessings and cursings, that if you obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give to you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations, and these blessings will come upon you if you obey the Lord your God. You'll be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed. The crop of your land will be blessed. The young of your livestock, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading bowls will be blessed. You'll be blessed when you come out. You'll be blessed when you go in. It goes on to say, when you fight against your enemies, you'll be victorious. But then it also says that if you disobey, conversely, you'll be cursed in all those areas, and the ultimate curse is that you'll be expelled from the land, Deuteronomy 28:64. In fact, this theology of blessing and curse is going to be reflected in the historical books that will follow, that when Israel obeys, they are blessed. When they disobey, they bring curse upon themselves, and that curse ultimately is expulsion from the land. Deuteronomy 29-34 talks about the covenant and grace in the end. Deuteronomy 29-33 conveys Israel's renewal of the covenant, in which heaven and earth serve as witnesses of this covenant renewal. But then it ends with an account of Moses' death, and in that section, before Moses' death actually, it says this, that when these blessings of curse I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations. Notice here, by the way, that God assumes they're going to disobey and end up being dispersed. And when your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything that I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you from the nations. And skipping to verse 6, the Lord will circumcise your hearts and the heart of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. Israel was destined to fail. They were going to be disobedient. They were going to be expelled from the land, according to this text. And yet God promises that they would be brought back to the land and their fortunes restored. Even promises to circumcise their heart. That is, giving them a heart that would want to obey. Jeremiah describes this under the New Covenant section, that God would write the law on their hearts. And Ezekiel talks about removing from the people the heart of stone and giving them a heart of flesh. Well, this promise that God would restore them and bring them back to the land after they disobeyed and were expelled from the land is going to be picked up by the prophets, who will take encouragement that God will restore Israel after the exile back to the land. Jeremiah in particular will talk about this. So you have grace despite disobedience, so that the promise will continue. So the whole book is a covenant renewal document. It renews the Mosaic covenant for a new generation. And we Christians also are in a covenant relationship with God, a different covenant, the new covenant. But we too, from time to time, need to renew that relationship. And each new generation must reaffirm it. Thus concludes our discussion of the book of Deuteronomy.